I'm a consultant family and couples systemic psychotherapist. I'm the CEO of the Association of Family Therapy. And I'm also a director at the Child and Family Practice, which is based in central London. And I founded the London Intercultural Couple Centre there. I've also edited and written 4 textbooks now, 2 of which will be launched this year, and lots of journal articles. And I used to be the editor of the Journal of Family Therapy. I grew up in India and I studied psychology as for my undergraduate degree and as a master's degree as well. I first started out studying psychology with a sort of specialization in clinical psychology for my master's at Delhi University. And during that time, I attended a workshop by Anne Miller, and she introduced us to systemic ideas, to family therapy and systemic ideas. This was in 1990. Yes, that's right. It was in 1990. So a very long time ago now. And I remember reading an article that she gave us from the Family Networker, an American publication by Murray Bowen on family systems theory, as it was called in those days. And particularly, I still remember very vividly the picture of triangles. And it said, 2-person systems are unstable and they need to pull in a third person, which could be, it doesn't necessarily have to be a person, but it could even be an in-law, well, that is a person, but, work. So it's talking about couple relationships and how they kind of stabilize. Well, I think having grown up in a family where communication was very interesting and very sort of multi-leveled, I think it appealed to me immediately because I could apply a lot of those ideas to my own family background. And around this time, my research dissertation supervisor at a master's level was a psychoanalyst. And I kind of started insisting on drawing on systemic ideas during my dissertation, which he wasn't pleased with at all. So we had this huge tussle. And then after I finished my master's, I moved with my first husband to Singapore and found a family therapy training there. And in fact, that was the family therapy training that later on Barry Mason and others from the Institute of Family Therapy taught on. But when I trained there, I had teachers like Alan Crooklyn, Jill Gorrell-Barnes, Elsa Jones, and David Campbell. And it was a wonderful, interesting, and rich time. They were our teachers from the UK, from the Institute of Family Therapy. But we also had some excellent teachers from the Counselling and Care Centre in Singapore. And in fact, that course is still, still around. It was, those 2 years were just really, really rich. And that kind of really gave me a very good foundation, a clinical foundation as well. So I finished my 2 years, my first 2 years of the family therapy training in Singapore. And so my professional life is sort of caught up with my personal life, as I guess all our lives are. I got divorced then and moved back to India. I was a single parent and I wanted to be closer to home, as it were, even though Singapore had become my home. And that's when I started practicing as a family therapist. There was no register of family therapy at the time. I don't think there was even at this point in India. As I sort of developed further in my profession there as a family therapist and psychologist, I invited, along with some colleagues, dear colleagues, I invited David Campbell to come from the Tavistock and do some training for us there. And he came and he got really interested in our Indian Association of Family Therapy and kind of headhunted myself and a colleague and friend to come to the Tavistock and finish our family therapy training. I'd done the first 2 years, but he thought I should complete my family therapy training. And then the plan was that he would come back there with us, at least part of the time, and set up a sort of Tavistock India chapter. So that was a very ambitious plan that we kind of hatched, the three of us, and my friend Reenee Singh and myself came here to embark on a 2-year family therapy training at the Tavistock. And there was something about coming here to the UK which helped me to begin to think about different cultural contexts and how they shape different family forms and relationships within the family. And because I had also lived in Singapore, I think, I had these three contexts, and that was quite rich. I remember one of the first families I was working with, I was behind the screen, and there was talk about how the 12-year-old boy, I think, still slept in his mother's bed. And the team was really alarmed, and they said that they wanted to contact social services. And this was a child protection issue. I remember being absolutely aghast, partly because there was no welfare state and no child protection was such an alien concept anyway for me to sort of get my head around and grapple with. And then the thought that sleeping for a 12-year-old boy to sleep in his mother's bed was terrible was again something that, I just found quite alien, and I couldn't relate to their alarm. So it was like almost every day there would be, or certainly every time we met as a clinical supervision group, I would kind of bump up against some real difference and grapple with it. And I tried to tease out some of these things and write about them. And then that later on formed the kind of basis of my doctoral thesis, because of course I didn't go back, and I just found the work so interesting. My doctorate was really in the field of cross-cultural family therapy, and I was looking at quite specifically about constructions of the family. I actually started out with the idea that we talk about family therapy, and yet both the family and therapy can mean such different things in different cultures. So that was the starting point for my doctoral thesis. And because I was looking at kinship and the family, I was also reading a lot of anthropological literature, psychoanalysis, sociology, but within the family therapy and systemic field, I was influenced by Britt Krause's ideas. I was looking at Celia Falikov's work. I was looking at Kenneth Hardy's work and Nancy Boyd Franklin's work. And that became kind of the theoretical foundation, if you like, of my doctoral work. And so it led to a very rich, kind of almost an explosion of ideas. And towards the end of it, I discovered Kyle Killian's work. His 2001 article on interracial couples. And I thought, wow, this is exactly what I've been looking for. And by that time, I was married to my second husband, who's English. And I thought that, thinking about race and culture, as I had been, but applying it to couple relationships and how it plays out in the couple relationship, as well as how society regards intercultural couples, which were far less common in 2001. Yes, even, a little bit later when I finished my doctorate than they are now. And that was sort of the direction that I then became interested in, really thinking about couple relationships. Kyle Killian's paper in 2001 was about the sort of invisibility of being able to talk about racial and cultural differences. Just how difficult it was for intercultural couples to think about and talk about, how dangerous almost it seemed. And that was the bit that grabbed me, I think, about the article. The minority, ethnic or Black partners being thought of as hypersensitive, inverted commas, if they sort of alluded to anything to do with racial difference. And that was my experience, and I think it kind of spoke to me. And I began to wonder about the UK context and whether it was different here. And because, it's not just about Black and white couples, but there's a lot more, there are all kinds of different couplings here across race and culture. And it seemed, certainly in London, it seemed much more acceptable. In 2009, I got my consultant post at the Tavistock, and that was mostly teaching and supervising master's and doctoral students and running the master's course. And also, clinical practice, lots and lots of clinical work, but that was quite generic. So it was quite a different period of time, really. I wasn't thinking that much about intercultural, cross-cultural work, except through supervising students who were interested in these areas, both at a master's and doctoral level. Some of the themes, and they were all different, of course, but some of the themes that emerged kind of cut across all these intercultural couples. One of them being the meaning of home and belonging, and for every intercultural couple, there was this idea of home, where home is, whose territory they're living on, And for both of them, for both the partners, regardless of where they originally came from, the sense that actually they had created a home together that didn't look like either of their homes. Religion is huge with a lot of the intercultural, interfaith couples I work with. The issues around conversion, often to Islam, but sometimes to Judaism or some other religion. How intercultural, interfaith couples can negotiate these cultural differences, especially where it comes to parenting. There's the whole issue of language and how fascinating that can become. Sometimes it's more than two languages. It could be three or four languages in the mix, and how they when I sort of work with couples where language is an issue, I often think of Charlotte Burke's work, and how language is kind of used in intercultural couples to mark power differences, inclusion and exclusion, how children get caught up. Sometimes I've had these really fascinating families where they'll come in with a problem to do with one of the children, but often, it centers around language. And once you kind of disentangle the issues, they sometimes have to do with how the expectations are that the family will kind of speak only in one language rather than in all, or one partner's language is dominant, and then the expectations are that the children speak in that language. So, these are some of the sort of common themes, if you like, that come up in my work with intercultural couples. I think my first published paper was in 1996, and that was actually my dissertation from my first 2 years of family therapy training. I wrote a dissertation on rituals in family therapy. And later on, I remember at a conference, I met somebody who worked for Human Systems. She said, would you be interested in writing for Human Systems? So I thought, sure. I didn't know what Human Systems was, but I thought, well, why not? I've got this dissertation. I'll give it a shot. By this time, I was living in India, and I was actually writing and editing for the Indian Psychologist. I was one of the editors. So I just sort of started writing. That's how I started writing about my clinical practice, writing about the intercultural work I was doing, and trying to grapple with these differences. And I do think that that's why a lot of us write. We write because it helps us to think, and to make sense. But I guess what I haven't said is that David Campbell was a huge source of inspiration for me as well. He was absolutely inspiring, as well as Charlotte Burke, who was my research supervisor. And David encouraged me to write. So I remember taking a sort of germ of an idea to him in terms of my first book, what became my first book. And he said, yes, of course, we'd love to publish that. He was the series editor for Karnak at that point. And so, we just wrote it up and published it. And it seemed quite easy, actually, and quite seamless. And I guess that's because so many of the ideas had been in my head for a long time. I wonder if that's how a lot of life is, for many of us. It certainly is for me, that, it's not as if things sort of happen after a lot of toil and trouble, but almost kind of just happen as part of a course of life. The journal editorship as well, just kind of, I was on the board from about 2009. And then I was invited, I applied to the post of editor. And it was just very, very rewarding and very enjoyable, something I really enjoyed. And then on the back of that, when I had finished my editorship, which is a term of 4 years, I was invited to edit the Handbook of Systemic Family Therapy, which is an American publication. But on the whole, it was just such an exciting experience. It was fun. It was great to connect with so many UK authors. So we had chapters by Peter Stratton, Gail Simon, Jenny Altschuler, Liz Forbat, Ivan Eisler. We had so many wonderful authors as contributors to the handbook. And just the process of doing it was so rich. Becoming the CEO of the Association of Family Therapy has been very exciting. And really my main purpose and goal nowadays is how to gain visibility for family therapy. And then, electronic resources. I've been thinking a lot about this whole area of, the internet and how it impacts on our lives. I guess this has really become my next sort of passion, if you like, an area I'd really like to develop is to think about how we can offer teaching, training, clinical services online, and yet maintain a lot of our rigor and standards. In 2013, I met Professor Valeria Ogazio, and she was a friend of David Campbell's and has done some fascinating work where she develops a clinical theory to think about how psychopathology in families is associated with different semantics. And she describes 4 semantics. Anyway, I found her theory fascinating. So one of the things I decided to do is to develop a relationship with her, a professional relationship with her, and went to teach her students in Bergamo, at the University of Bergamo, every year as a visiting professor. And then we started working on a project, a research project, to do with semantics in intercultural couples. And we were on the verge of publishing, we finished the whole research project, and we were on the verge of writing together and publishing out of it this year when COVID-19 struck. But hopefully soon after things settle down, write and publish a lot of our work, because it is really on intercultural couples and thinking about the different semantics. And we're sort of trying to make a case that intercultural couples might come from very different semantics, and that it might actually be quite helpful for them to have to negotiate their differences, and that their relationships, I mean, this is what the early findings are pointing to, that their relationships might actually be more resilient and more robust as a result of having to negotiate their differences. So that's just sort of a very early kind of preview. But we did a workshop at IFT last year, which is quite well attended. And we have a whole group of students, some from Bergamo, some from the Institute of Family Therapy, who have used my clinical work with intercultural couples and as part of this largest Italian study.